Good morning, everyone. My name is Adam. I'm the EMEA Sales Manager for Webroot Software, and you're joining me here in conjunction with CMS Distribution to look at the future of cybersecurity and take a little look at the threat landscape, some best practices around security, and also some predictions about what we might see in the future. So without further ado, I'll get started. In terms of the agenda, I'm going to talk a little bit about the victims, motives and costs of cybercrime at the moment, and then I'm going to move on to today's threat landscape. And we've got some great insight from one of our senior threat researchers, Kelvin Murray, on the latest threats that Webroot's seeing as a business. I'm then going to move on, and after scaring everyone half to death, I'm going to talk about some best practices to beat modern malware. So some very, very simple steps that you can take within your organization to remove the risk of malware within your business. And then obviously as a cybersecurity company, I would be foolish not to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about Webroot and why we're a little bit different and how we can help prevent the scourge that is ransomware. So let's take a look at victims and motives. And when I was preparing this presentation, I thought it would be a good idea to take a look at how many people are actually online and what the size of the opportunity is for cyber criminals. And as it stands, half the world's population is online. And if we look at what they're doing when they're online, there's more than 2 billion Facebook users, over 1 billion WhatsApp users, more than 1.5 billion users of YouTube every year. So people are plugged into this cyber world. And if you're online, then you're a potential target for a cyber criminal. I think also some of the stats around how many new devices are being added to the virtual world every month are quite scary. There's 328 million new devices, and by 2020 we're set to see 50 billion devices online. And with the recent news stories around killer robots and the threat that AI poses to human life, I thought I would include a little campaign to stop killer robots logo there. We absolutely live in cyberspace. Most people spend half their life either on their phone or on their PC. And according to the website This Is Money, more than 50% of Britain's bank online and more than 75% of the shop online. So we're opening up our banking credentials and our credit cards to cyber criminals if our machines have been compromised. So all of this is kind of just showing the size of the opportunity for cyber criminals, really. Cybercrime, for the first time in its history, has surpassed traditional crime in the UK. And that, I suppose, isn't a surprise, given that traditional fraud has been locked down. Global annual cybercrime is set to reach 6 trillion by 2021. And as an American company based in Ireland, I thought I'd throw a stat in there about Ireland. Nearly 1 in 5 businesses incurred losses of between around 100k and 5 million euros. So it's definitely impacting businesses, and I think this year we've seen an even bigger impact to businesses across the world, not just in terms of real-time outages, but also in terms of stocks and shares and how the impact of share prices has been affected by cybercrime. Struggling to change my slide. So just give me 2 seconds. I don't seem to be able to change my presentation. So I think. Sorry, excuse me for the pause there. I think cybercrime definitely is starting to get a lot cleverer. I think security solutions are starting to get better at preventing viruses and ransomware. And I think definitely what we're seeing now is more targeted attacks. So people actually singling out organizations and users within organizations to use social engineering to dupe people. Definitely, as we said on the outset of this webinar, that schools, hospitals, government are being targeted, and there are reasons behind that, and I'll go into those in some later slides. But yeah, definitely it's something we're seeing even in some of the biggest hospitals like St. Bart's that have been taken offline for a period of time thanks to cyber criminals. and people are paying ransoms, unfortunately. So, I mean, why do hospitals make the perfect targets? Ultimately, for a hospital to run, nurses and doctors need to have access to patient records and information about, history of a patient and what medication they're taking. If you can take that offline, you cripple the hospital. You can also do things like delay operations, and we've seen that when certain pieces of hardware were hacked. And I think typically hospitals are quite large, complicated networks of both staff and machines. It's quite difficult to manage and keep up to date, and we've seen that with legacy operating systems. I think also something that I didn't mention here is that hospitals rely on applications that are developed for specific platforms, and as operating systems change and databases change, it's quite a costly process to move those applications to new operating systems, to new databases, and so inevitably hospitals and I suppose critical infrastructure has to run on older operating systems as applications aren't ported through to those newer operating systems. In terms of businesses in general, I thought this stat was very, very interesting. In the previous 12 months, more than 40% of businesses in the UK were hit by ransomware. In the US, it was more than 50%. So I think we're doing slightly better here, but I think that's because we're not being targeted as much as the US is. Germany has been hit quite significantly as well in terms of 20% of their businesses hit by ransomware in the past 12 months. Another area for concern is definitely credential theft and password theft. Passwords are getting cracked or guessed and then sold online every day, and people should definitely take control. There are basic steps that you can take, which we'll talk about a little bit later down the presentation, but it's very much something that you should be aware of. Sites like Have I Been Pawned can tell you whether or not your credentials have been stolen and then put online, and so that's probably quite a good resource to use if you are concerned that your password or your credentials may have been used fraudulently. I think in terms of motives, it's very lucrative. Ransomware payloads have generated around about $1 billion in 2016, which is quite scary. And then it's only going to carry on going up. I think inevitably, security companies get accused of scaremongering, and I think you have to put things into perspective. There were some stats I pulled from the Barclay blog, which said that every 10 seconds a consumer gets hit by ransomware, and that's up from 20 seconds in Q1 of 2016. And every 40 seconds a company gets hit by ransomware. So we can see that the growth in ransomware is growing exponentially, both in a business context, but also from a consumer perspective as well. And in 2017, the estimates of the cost of ransomware were somewhere in the region of $5 billion. So it's multiplied by 5 based on what we saw in 2016. So it's rampantly growing. I think in terms of identifying the cost of business, and I think we're pretty much speaking to IT professionals on this webinar. Questions that I always pose to customers is, how much would it cost you if your systems went down for a day, or your core business system went down? How long would it take you to restore that core business system? What happens if one of your departments, your marketing department or your sales department or your finance department was offline for a day? What would that cost you? Or offline for a week? And so I suppose it's bottoming out the cost to a business in terms of the loss of systems to try and work out what the cost might be to put in place adequate preventative measures. And there are some free things you can do, and we're going to cover those off a little bit later down the line, but definitely security solutions form a part of your armory against ransomware. And I thought I'd touch on a couple of the high profile business cases, because this doesn't apply to small business, but it does show that actually it's becoming a problem both for big business, government, and for small business alike. The makers of Nurofen and Durex, Reckitt and Benckiser, that they ended up being hit for about £100 million. Modelex, Modelex, that's an autocomplete error there. That should be Mondelez. They're the guys that own Cadbury's now. Said that their quarterly sales were hit by 3% due to the Phishing Attack just recently. And if you're talking about 6.5 billion sales annually, that's $1.5 billion per quarter. 3% of that is quite a significant chunk of business, and so this is hitting people in real terms. Maersk, the big shipping magnate, that they had 76 of their ports taken down, which cost 70 million in terms of lost transaction fees, but it also wiped 1% off the face of the company. So these are all real hits to large organizations. This stat I was quite concerned about, actually, and it shows that we are paying ransoms, which is not the genuine perceived wisdom. In the US, only 3% of ransoms were paid, and I think they're towing the government line. In Canada, 75% of ransoms were paid. Now, interestingly, almost 60% of the ransoms that were asked for were paid in the UK, which I find quite surprising, because in quite a lot of these ransomware attacks, actually, you can't get your data back because it's been poorly encrypted, or all the encryption keys don't get made available. So that might be a waste of money. So we've talked a little bit about the cost and about the effects of ransomware. So how does it get in? And you won't be surprised to see that the vast majority of ransomware and security breaches and incidents in 2016 were caused by phishing. So someone sending an email or a redirect or an advert that takes you to a website where your credentials or an application is installed. Your credentials are stolen or an application is installed. And another thing that's quite interesting as well is 94% of all malware seen is unique to a single endpoint. Right? That's what we call polymorphic, which basically means that it changes every time that it installs, which means that malware is getting much more creative to evade security. Social engineering is definitely something that's still very, very effective, and that can come via email, it can come via a link, and it's normally trying to take advantage of known brands to elicit a response. So this one that was run in the US, anyone that is not, anyone that's paying attention, I shouldn't be disparaging about people that fall for phishing attacks, because it's very easy to fall for phishing attack. But if you're paying attention here, you'll see that this is USPS and it's not UPS. But this is a phishing attack, which is basically it's a social engineering attack that exploits a macro infection. And what's happening here is that you'll receive a fake email that says, "Hey, we tried to deliver a package. In order to find out where that package is, you just need to open this Word document. And in order to do that, you just need to enable macros." Now, macros are disabled by default in Windows, and there's a good reason for that. And that's because typically they're normally used to run malicious code on your endpoint, or make a call out to a website that they will then download some malicious code. And so we would always suggest that you keep macros switched off, and you should advise your users not to use macros. What normally will happen here is the macro will either try to install an application, or it will try and download something maliciously from a website. And as long as your security solution, your antivirus solution is monitoring macro scripts and also call outs to command and control websites and those downloads that are coming in, then in theory you should be protected. But it's still a creative way of getting through to end users. In terms of email, absolutely hugely popular, always has been. Email filtering should, in theory, remove malicious documents and take malicious URLs out of emails and out of attached documents, but it is still quite challenging to do. One big step forward is that JavaScript files are going to be blocked by Gmail, which will obviously reduce the risk of scripts impacting your environment. Phishing is definitely something that we still see, and it's a very, very big part of the way in which people are compromised. Zero-day phishing websites are always the case. Nowadays, a phishing website will come up and go down within less than 4 or 5 hours. And what we often see is common websites and website providers are being taken. abused in order to give legitimacy to malicious websites. So that might be malvertising, or it could be domain shadowing, where domains are cracked, or the credentials to create new subdomains within a known good domain are obtained, and then pages are created. And this graphic here shows the unique 0-day URLs seen by Webroot. So that in month by month in 2016. So we're seeing 300,000 net new web addresses every month that are malicious. It's kind of quite scary. We've already talked about macros, and I've already gone into why macros are a threat, and they're definitely a real threat still. RDP is probably not something people are that aware of, but as IT guys, you probably understand the risks that are associated with RDP. RDP is a remote control mechanism in Windows, used by systems admins to control resources remotely. The problem with RDP is that normally you're using admin rights, and it will give hackers access to your whole network. The default port is very, very easy to scan for. So it's quite easy to work out whether or not someone's using RDP and whether or not they're communicating on RDP using the default port with weak passwords. A lot of the time people use weak passwords for some reason, I don't know why, and accounts can normally be cracked by brute force. And that's how we see quite a lot of attacks happening, because once you've got RDP access onto a server, you're effectively creating a virtual connection onto that server, which is a little bit more challenging to monitor by security solutions. And if we look at exposed RDP endpoints across the world, we can see in the United Kingdom there were more than 100, close to 120,000, or 3% of the overall endpoints with RDP ports exposed. In the US, it was more than 1.2 million, so that's quite huge, and it's a larger percentage, 30% of those machines where that capability was available. Exploit kits is probably something you've heard of, but they're still relatively popular, although less so now. Things like Angler and Neutrino, which are both exploit kits. Effectively, you pay a subscription to be able to access machines that have certain Windows vulnerabilities that haven't been patched, and you can access those through an exploit kit, or almost like it's basically ransomware as a service. It's what we call RAS, because we love to give acronyms to stuff in the IT industry, but it's basically a website, almost like a portal, where you can gain access to machines that have been compromised, and then use exploits to drop ransomware onto those endpoints. But we're seeing exploit kits as less popular now versus emails or phishing attacks. And definitely Adobe, Flash and Java still very much a problem. We're still seeing droppers coming from these software, and so a lot of the time you hear about having to patch Java and Flash just because there's an exploit that's been found, and what cyber criminals are doing is using that exploit to drop malicious payloads within a customer's environment. And so making sure that you patch Java, Adobe PDF and Adobe Flash regularly is very important, because that's definitely still quite a popular infection mechanism. So I've talked a little bit about how we get infected. I think the biggest interest at the moment, and the most popular and the most headline grabbing type of malware is ransomware, and encrypting ransomware at that. And so I wanted to dedicate part of the presentation to encrypting ransomware and how that's evolving, and what we're seeing as new tactics within this kind of very, very interesting landscape. Cryptolocker, I think that was what people referred to ransomware back when it first became apparent that this was a thing, and that was just a variant of ransomware. I think what happened initially was that ransomware used a kind of like a client server architecture. So you had a server that was giving out encryption keys, and it was quite easy to find those encryption keys and decrypt your data. And I think a couple of security companies, people like FireEye, made public these decryption keys to allow people to get around the first instances of ransomware. But obviously these things evolve very, very quickly. Loads of innovative improvements were introduced into the ransomware, and it's constantly evolving. I think one of the first iterations of ransomware was something called CoinVault, which gave you the ability to decrypt one of your files, and that obviously it allows you to build trust in the fact that you're probably going to get the rest of your files if you pay the ransom. Another one was PadCrypt, which I thought was quite cute, which had a live chat feature, so you could chat to the cyber criminal who'd been stealing your files, and then ask him whether or not he was gonna give you your files back, which it seems kind of quite ironic. Hey, Mr. Criminal, just wanted to be sure that if I give you this money, you're going to give me my data back. Kind of crazy, but apparently it worked quite well. Lockie's probably something that you guys are familiar with. I think that's hit quite a lot of machines of late, and new variants keep being released of Lockie. I think what was quite novel about Lockie was that it scrambles the names of the files that it encrypts, which makes restoring from backup a right pain in the backside. I think this is a very real problem, and as we said, in previous slides, or as I said in previous slides, that it's cost business $1 billion in 2016. It's going to be as much as $5 billion in 2017. It is pretty much impossible to crack. It's normally using 128K encryption, which is military grade encryption. It does make files irretrievable. It does. I mean, if you were to try and decrypt encrypted files using one machine, it would take longer than the rest of time to decrypt those files. Even if you put all the computing power in the world into decrypting files encrypted using these algorithms, it probably would take millions of years. So it's pretty much impossible to decrypt once you've been encrypted. So there are things you really should be doing, like backing up your data, backing up critical resources, making sure you've got a restore plan. It's key. And as the quantity of ransomware is increasing hand over fist, we've noted 458 different variants and counting, and we see several hundred added to the list every year. I wanted to talk as well a little bit about WannaCry and Petya, because they've been the biggest ransomwares in the media, and I think the fact that quite a lot of high-profile organizations were taken offline, or parts of the businesses were taken offline, made the world sit up and listen, and it became not just a problem for IT geeks, but a problem for business owners as well. Yeah, I mean, people like FedEx, TNT, lots of high-profile hospitals, banks, power companies were all hit by these particular variants. And I think what was quite worrying was that some of these, or definitely WannaCry, was taking advantage of exploits put into Microsoft software by the American government or by Microsoft themselves. I don't really know how those exploits were put into the software, but they were designed to allow government officials to remotely access systems anywhere, and they were the backdoors that were leveraged by the WannaCry ransomware, and it did mean that actually it was preventable. A patch was released by Microsoft in the March of this year, which would have prevented WannaCry from being able to attack systems, and it just wasn't patched uniformly. And the reason that we call WannaCry and Petya lateral ransomware is because they spread laterally through an environment. They're effectively a worm, and they're quite difficult to remove. Normally, what WannaCry was doing was putting a call out to check to see which machines were unpatched, and then trying to infect those machines. So basically scanning the network. Worms are generally can append malicious code to normal executables, which means that getting rid of them is pretty challenging. They do generally require quite a lot of skill to create, which prompted a lot of professionals in the industry to say that they thought that potentially WannaCry and Petya were state sponsored, because you do need to be pretty adept at coding But I think what's really impacted the spread of these worms is the release of the exploits by people like the shadow brokers that release information on exploits that have been found within software. So exploits. The Equation Group are a CIA affiliated hacking outfit. They have quite a few zero-day exploits at their disposal, and as you can see here, there's quite a few exploits that they stole back in August that they've been able to leverage and use to deploy malware, ransomware onto machines. Just to give a little bit more color on the WannaCry piece of malware, it infects machines via the Eternal Blue SMB exploit, and that's the same exploit that it used to spread laterally throughout an environment, and it uses homegrown encryption, so it uses encryption on the machine in order to encrypt files, so it doesn't even need its own encryption program, which makes it very, very powerful and very, very difficult to stop. The only way you can stop it is by patching your systems. And so I think this was probably a big wake-up call to IT pros, and probably an area where resellers and MSPs can add value in terms of making sure systems are patched. And the vast majority of our partners were not hit by the WannaCry or Petya because they do adopt a robust patching strategy alongside their Webroot software. So I mean, it's definitely about patching. It's definitely about making sure that you're backing up data. Some of the WannaCry victims, very, very high-profile organizations like Portugal Telecom, Banco Bilbao in Spain, Telefonica in Spain. The NHS in the UK was hit quite badly. St Bart's, among others. Nissan UK. So some very, very big names here of organisations that have been hit by WannaCry. So it was pretty much universal. Although the first instances of WannaCry were seen or were exploited to take down power installations in Ukraine, I think. I think we're calling WannaCry the most successful ransomware ever, but that's just purely because of the number of machines that were hit by the infection. It didn't actually generate that much revenue. It probably only generated about $80,000, which is pretty small in the grand scheme of things. But I don't think I don't think this was a financially motivated infection, which makes a lot of the cybersecurity professionals think that this was potentially a state-sponsored piece of malware because it used a static Bitcoin address, and that's kind of risky because using just one static Bitcoin address could potentially be found out, and would have an audit trail to the creators of the malware. Not Petya was a new variant of Petya. I think the world was still just coming to terms with WannaCry, and then Not Petya hit. It, as is pretty typical with the majority of these attacks, this one began in the Ukraine. A Russian affiliated hacking group was responsible, and a lot of the time they like using Ukraine as a test bed for new malware and new attacks. I mean, we've seen a lot of news stories about the Ukraine power companies being taken offline. I think there was a news story about the automated testing of radiation in Chernobyl being taken offline, and the monitoring agency having to resort to manual testing. This infection looks very, very similar to Petya, which is why it was kind of referred to as Not Petya. It is a totally new infection. It spreads again using the Eternal Blue exploit, but it's also spread using SMB, WMI, PSExec, and quite a few other tricks. And I think what was quite challenging with this particular infection is it runs without Windows booting. So it uses the master boot record in order to load into systems, which again is pretty worrying. It can encrypt data before the machine even starts, and once you've encrypted the master boot record, you can't actually boot Windows. I think one of the reasons that this was quite popular or quite devastating in Ukraine was that there was a Ukrainian tax program that was hacked, and updates were pushed out with this malware loaded. But it did spread very rapidly using the SMB exploit in the same way as WannaCry did. But this one also harvested admin credentials and used WMI and PSExec and quite a few other tricks to kind of get better penetration into organizations. It was designed to maximize damage and chaos, which again makes us think that it was a state-sponsored attack and not necessarily something that was driven by cyber criminals, because actually paying the ransom was almost impossible. And because improper encryption happened, the files were pretty much unrecoverable. So points to state-sponsored cybercrime. So moving on, and I'm thinking that everyone's quite terrified now about the possible impact of ransomware, but I'm going to cover off some simple techniques that you can take in order to prevent ransomware from taking hold within your business, alongside good security solutions, of course. Ad golas. I'm basically, this is a malvertising campaign, and for anyone not familiar with malvertising, it's basically an advert containing malware. The problem that you have with ad service networks is they're quite difficult to police. It's quite easy to load adverts into an ad network, pay with your credit card or with a PayPal account or with Bitcoin even, and then get your ad campaign out there into the wild. And that ad campaign potentially is looking to try and get some kind of Trojan downloaded to your endpoint, or some encrypting ransomware. Ad golas was quite interesting in as much as it was trying to get a banking Trojan deployed to endpoints. It's polymorphic, so it sends different malware dependent upon the user and the geography. And this one's been running since 2015, and it's being deployed using quite a few high-rank referrers on various ad agency and ad exchange platforms. I think that the scheme managed to generate more than 1 million plus browser visits in 1 week. So that's a million hits getting that banking Trojan deployed. So in terms of the country specific and that kind of polymorphic element to it, I mean, you can see there specific types of infections dependent upon the country, so slightly different dependent whether or not the end user was in the UK, Canada, Australia, Spain. All of them would be redirected to a new banking website and a banking Trojan deployed. And a lot of the time, these fake sites, so they're effectively browser infections, or kind of man-in-the-middle attacks. So what they're trying to do is deploy something to steal money or information from end users or businesses. I think what was quite scary about ad golas was the scale of the operation. It was very much a complicated infrastructure in order to get that malicious malware and then the data from the malware back to a command and control center. I think a lot of work was put into creating authentic looking sites so that users got fooled. That a lot of the time they were spoofing HTTPS certificates. So people are thinking, actually, this looks like it's genuine. I'm seeing an HTTPS certificate. My IT guy has told me that I need to make sure that I'm using HTTPS traffic, and they were, and it was still it was still a malicious payload. It was still a malicious redirect. Yeah, it's I think one of the things that this proves is that it's very, very hard even for professionals to spot phishing and malicious attacks. It really is becoming more and more challenging. there was a recent update to this campaign, and this was the reason I mentioned on the outset, is that as well as just banking Trojans, this campaign is now being used to deploy ransomware, so drive-by ransomware infections. And actually, the problem with the way a lot of machines are set up is that you don't actually need to click on anything. You just need to go to a website that has a malicious advert running on it, and depending upon the permissions that your web browser has, malicious software can be deployed into temporary folders running on your computer. So yeah, this one's a pretty challenging one to prevent. It's using full HTTPS, so it's quite difficult to spot that it is a malicious website. It's using domain shadowing, i.e., basically getting known good domains and then creating subdomains that then host that malicious software. So I think you're probably suitably afraid, and you shouldn't be, because there are some kind of pretty straightforward things you can do within your environment to prevent yourself from getting compromised by new variants of malware. And these aren't going to make you 100% safe, but if you couple best practices alongside a decent security solution, then I think you stand a layered approach to security, then you stand a pretty good chance of preventing these kind of infections. And a lot of these things seem so simple, and they seem like they should already be in place, but making sure that you're updating your machines, that you're disabling macros, that you're changing passwords and using complex passwords, that you're backing up your data, that you're browsing using a safe browser, that you're educating your staff, that you're using AV, that you're implementing good security best practices, are all things that probably people are doing, right? You'd be surprised. Updating everything, and I know that this is a pain, but you really do need to keep on top of your patch management. As WannaCry has shown, this infection was preventable. There was a Windows patch released in March that could have prevented WannaCry from affecting your environment. And so making sure that you're patching your Windows in an ideal world every couple of weeks, that really should be what you're aiming for. Patching stuff like Adobe and Java, because they will inevitably use droppers. Microsoft Office, because of the complexity of the application, inevitably has exploits that can be used. Making sure that you're patching your browsers as well. We've got customers that are using, Internet Explorer 7, and unfortunately, it doesn't matter how good the security solutions that you have on your computer, if you have an operating system or an application that has a security weakness, it's often very, very difficult for security software to prevent that from affecting your machine. So you really just need to make sure that you are patching applications as frequently as you possibly can without causing too much disruption to your users. Windows updates, as I said, it's absolutely essential. Ad blocking. Now you can download a free ad block piece of software, and that should get rid of. So even if they're appearing as a banner ad or embedded within a web page, if you install ad block, then you should stop adverts from being served to you. And whilst that's annoying for the advertisers, it probably is going to stop things like ad golas, like the advertising malware distribution. Some basic security policies: disabling auto run. Whilst perhaps a little bit frustrated for less educated users, I plug my USB key in, it doesn't do anything. I have to navigate to the USB key and then run something. It will stop automatic infection from CDs or from USB keys. Disabling the Windows scripting host. The vast majority of users don't need to access scripting within their environment. You could disable Windows scripting host and then enable it using a group policy when you need to use it. Have users running as limited admins and not limited users and not admins. So many times we see people that are local admins or domain admins. Creating domain admins and using that account for everything does mean that if your password gets compromised, then someone's got access to your whole network. Limiting write access where possible. Don't give people access to everything, because if they don't need to access the folder, they shouldn't necessarily have to access it. And then if something does happen, the worst case scenario, a machine gets compromised. If that person has just got access to their own shared drives, and those shared drives aren't connected permanently, then you're going to suffer less from a piece of encrypting ransomware that manages to get onto a network share and encrypt attached drives. And making sure macros are disabled is kind of super important too. But that should be the case. Disabling flash as well, probably a good idea. There was some analysis of the LinkedIn breach, and the number of people using the most pathetic passwords is crazy. There were more than 1 million people using the password 123456. More than 200,000 people using the password LinkedIn. Nearly 200,000 people using the password. You can download a password vault piece of software for free and use that as your one source of truth. Remember, one really, really complex password, and then for every single thing that you do online, create a separate password, save it in your password vault. That's the best way to make sure that you're not going to get compromised, and that if your credentials do get compromised, that then the cyber criminal doesn't have access to all of the things that you use online, because that's kind of key. Yeah, again, passwords should be complex. In an ideal world, you'd make sure they were at least 12 characters and that they were a mixture of numbers, letters, uppercase, symbols. I always say to people, use song lyrics, the first letters of a phrase that you know well, or a poem, or something that is much more difficult to crack, that isn't logical. Will make sure that you're less likely to have your password guessed or brute force cracked. Two-factor where you can, having recovery options, using a mobile phone as a recovery option, and having an expiry date. As a security company, we have to have passwords that expire. We expire every 90 days, and that's probably best practice for most organizations. People will hate you to start off with, and they'll be writing it down on pieces of paper by their desk. But I'd hazard a guess to say that it's probably safer leaving your password on a piece of paper by your machine or in your notepad than it is leaving your password as something very, very easy to crack and leaving it as the same for many, many months. You're much more likely to get it hacked that way, I would say anyway, but I'm not really a security professional per se. Always have a backup plan. Make sure that you're backing your data up. And there are some fantastic solutions out there. We work with quite a few backup providers. People like Acronis, ArcServe, Datto, all provide fantastic solutions. StorageCraft, these guys are all specialists in their field, and they all provide great backup solutions that will allow you to back up your data and make it very, very easy to restore, because at the end of the day, testing those backups and making sure they work is part of a robust backup strategy. Education, and I kind of caveated, the fact that actually it's quite easy to be duped, but the more questions your employees and your customers ask about the legitimacy of websites and emails, the better it is. Webroot has just acquired very, very conveniently just acquired a security training company that we're making part of our management portal, and that'll be available from the start of October. Security training shouldn't cost the earth, and should at least get your users and your customers asking the right questions. Is this real? Am I being phished? Is my password robust enough? It's definitely something that you should be considering. Now, I did say right at the outset that this would be an unashamed plug of our technology, because I do wholeheartedly believe in what we're doing, Webroot, and the way that we do security is slightly differentiated from some of the other solutions out there in the market. So I'll just take a couple of minutes to talk about Webroot, and I know this is perhaps something that you guys are perhaps familiar with already. So if I'm going over the same ground, my apologies. Webroot takes the power of the cloud and combines that with multi-vector protection to make sure that users are protected at every stage of the infection on the endpoint. And we're an American cybersecurity company. We've got many millions of endpoints under license. We white label our technology in a lot of different OEM partner solutions. People like Palo Alto, Cisco, F5. They use our cloud to protect their customers when they're routing traffic. And we're one of the leading providers of threat intelligence to the security industry. We've got great net promoter scores, industry's best customer satisfaction scores, 30% of the top 500 MSPs, #1 retail share in consumer AV in the US. It's now more than 11,000 MSP partners globally, and it's more than 180,000 business customers. So we're still a small company, but we're growing, and I think that's because our technology makes sense. It's a different way to protecting endpoints and not something that most people are typically that used to. We have a very, very small client that can be deployed alongside any other security solution and it won't cause conflict. It's a 750K agent, installs in 2 or 3 seconds, scans in normally 1 or 2 minutes, uses some kind of quite clever change gelling and rollback technology to allow us to keep track of unknown applications should those become known malicious at some point in the future. We use the power of the cloud, so as soon as we've seen a virus anywhere in the world, that then becomes part of our collective threat intelligence. And we're also keeping track of phishing attacks as they happen in real time, both through our users and through our third-party customers like Cisco and Palo Alto, who are reinforcing our cloud in real time. And I think that the way that the Webroot works is key to protecting you against modern malware attacks, because a lot of the time a piece of malware won't just try and use one way to get into your endpoint and compromise your data. It'll be using lots of different mechanisms to try and compromise your security. And so, normally the first attack vector will be something like an email, or potentially something through a web browser, a display ad or hyperlink, or a social media application, maybe a USB drive. And Webroot brings in a web threat shield to prevent you from malicious attacks coming from outside, and uses something called the identity shield to prevent malicious applications from stealing key presses when you're working with your web browser or any other application within your environment. There's obviously the second stage of infection, which is normally the payload delivery stage. And what Webroot's looking for at that point is droppers within your environment. So is an application trying to deploy something to your hard disk? Is a known good application like Java trying to drop something into your temporary folder? Is the internet browser trying to drop something into your temporary internet files to run on your system? And Webroot has a series of shields designed to prevent that payload delivery stage. But I think where we very much excel, and where our customers will tell you we excel, is that we try to reduce the impact of an infection. What we try and do is keep track of changes made by an unknown application within your environment, and that allows us to roll back to a state that a machine was in before an infection was seen. And so that journaling and rollback and that behavioral monitoring allows us to keep track of unknown files, because at the end of the day, as we said right at the outset of this presentation, 94% of malware is only ever seen on one machine. And how you deal with those unknown applications, those unknown malware, is key to preventing your environment from being infected. And even if that unknown malware doesn't get detected when it's first deployed to your environment, having a security solution which can monitor that malware and keep track of its changes does allow you to remediate properly. Because one of the problems you see with remediation is you try and remove a virus and it comes back. We try and remove a virus and it blue screens the machine, and that's what we're trying to get around. I think single vector protection is not going to protect you against the latest viruses, because all you're really doing at that point is monitoring to see whether or not something gets installed onto the computer, and that's not going to keep you protected. And that's why, when you look at a real world phishing attack, and how Webroot is able to protect you against that, using a combination of shields to prevent a call out from an email to a malicious website, or a download of a malicious payload to either the browser or a temporary file within the browser or to the endpoint, and then whether or not that then runs on your machine is all being protected against by the Webroot client. And I talked about the power of the cloud. So I've talked about multi-vector protection and how Webroot can protect you against those kind of complicated zero-day attacks, and with their differing kind of approaches to both the infection and the malicious effects on the endpoint. This is a very, very simplified graphic of the Webroot cloud and how it works. And so what we're doing effectively is everyone that's using the Webroot cloud is effectively reinforcing that cloud. So from our users, and more than 30 million of those, all collecting data on threats as they happen, to our third-party security providers, people like Virgin Media or Palo Alto or Cisco. All of these guys are sending threat intelligence data back in, as well as our internet sensor network, our honeypots, and our security partners. All of that is coming in and being contextualized and analyzed and put into a threat intelligence database that's trying to analyze the provenance of files, where they're coming from, what websites, what mobile applications are causing problems on mobile devices. And it's being brought together to create this contextual database in the cloud and Amazon's EC2 infrastructure that is constantly growing and learning and becoming smarter in real time. So someone may see a virus somewhere in Russia, and that virus is then automatically known about in real time. So that even if that virus is opened 5 seconds later on a machine in London, we know about that virus because the cloud knows about it. It's always been determined as bad, and so at that point you're being protected. And that's why we wholeheartedly believe in our approach, which is to put all of the processing and the intelligence into the cloud, into the Webroot threat intelligence platform. We've got more than 30 billion URLs classified now, 4 billion IP addresses, and we continuously monitor and classify the vast majority of the internet. We're monitoring the entire IPv4 space and in-use IPv6 space to give a holistic view of what's out there in the wild. I think if you were to test Webroot, you would see why we're a little bit different to those traditional security solutions. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer those. Obviously, you guys are all partners of CMS. I've recorded this presentation, and I'll be sharing that recording tomorrow. And I'll send that out in an email, just thanking you for coming along today. But I'm here to answer any questions. I'd love it if you took me up on my challenge and took a look at the Webroot software and saw exactly why we're so passionate about our technology and our approach to protecting customers against the latest threats. Yeah, thank you very much for your time. Has anyone got any questions? That's great. Well, I think that's about it. There's someone asking here. Yeah, so the beta for the education product, absolutely. The security awareness training, as we're giving it its catchy name, it's going to be available come October. But yes, I can absolutely organise a beta for you, Gareth. Yeah, no problem at all. Thanks. I'll get that sent over to you shortly. Smashing. Well, all that remains is for me to thank everyone again. Really appreciate you taking time out of your day to spend 50 minutes or so with me. Hopefully we'll get to chat again sometime in the near future. Thank you.